Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It is Friday, and so it is time for a weekend review. Each week, offensive security team is tracking, researching, and analyzing threats and vulnerabilities, and just basically keeping a finger on the pulse of the security world, so that we can bring this to you and maybe make you a little bit more squared away than you were yesterday. So, with that in mind, you've got myself, Brad, and Mr. Spencer here, both of us from the Offensive Security Group, here to talk about some cool stuff, man.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Another exciting week in the security world. For those kind of following along, couple things we wanted to talk about today were the BumbleBee malware loader report by the DFIR report. Really good report, and I think you'll see why when we get into that. We're also going to talk about SMS and voice phishing. Smishing and vishing for those who are
Please no.
the very triggering words, right? I think the community is torn. I think the hardcore people are like, no, please don't use those words. Let's just call it SMS phishing. But yeah.
I've never understood why we need to have a sexy name for literally every flavor of every attack in the hacker world. But it's what we have. So
yeah. People want to feel important, right? They come up with these fancy phrases. It's like, that was me that coined that word or phrase. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah. So yeah, we're going to be talking about some SMS phishing, voice phishing attacks that made pretty newsworthy this week. Pretty high profile attacks. Mm-hmm. So the first one is BumbleBee, BumbleBee malware. So this is from a DFIR report article. And essentially what happened was in April 2022, there were some threat actors that used BumbleBee malware for initial access, and then went on to perform a number of different techniques on the environment. They moved laterally, they prevesked, they did a whole bunch of things that are very common to see for kind of cyber criminal tradecraft. Everything done in this honestly kind of reads like a pen test to me. As I'm reading through this, I'm like, yeah, we've done these things on pen tests. These are things that we test on red team engagements. We test these things during purple team exercises. How well can we detect these things? So these are very common things that this actor was doing. And it just kind of shows that the cyber criminal tradecraft doesn't have to be super sophisticated. A lot of times the basic default things work, unfortunately. But that's a good opportunity for us as defenders to kind of key in on some of those things to help detect those things, especially the default configuration. As is the case with this article, the threat actor used a default Cobalt Strike configuration. And there's very well-known indicators for out-of-the-box Cobalt Strike, right?
Yeah.
So that's my first point of bringing up this article. The second point is this threat actor was in the environment for 11 days doing various different things. So what that means, and they were in there 11 days and they hadn't exfilled and they hadn't deployed ransomware yet, right?
It's pretty wild. That's unusual, I think, right?
I think it's unusual, but I think it gives us hope as defenders to say, okay, we have some time, right? We have some time. If a user gets phished, we get malware, maybe we have some time to detect these things. So a little glimmer of hope, I guess.
Sure. I think the current average time is like 72 hours is from the first second of initial access. I'd have to go double check that, but it's a pretty short period of time.
Yeah.
And so I want to point something out, and I'm looking at Jim right now, by the way. You can't see me doing it. I'm looking at Jim. We have had this discussion when we talk to blue teams all the time. We get pushback a little bit on especially internal pen testing, and even to a smaller degree external pen testing, when they say that's an unrealistic test. The things that you're doing are not the same as a true breach.
Yep.
And strictly speaking, it's true. I agree with that at a fundamental level. However, in almost every case, something that the threat actor does mimics or directly reproduces what we do, at least one aspect of what we do from an internal pen test perspective. So we can't always exactly replicate every single possible scenario for a breach, but in 99% of our internal pen tests, we're first of all, we're using bad guy techniques, right? But second of all, we will touch on one or more of the things that bad guys use in their attacks. So I took a long way around to say that even though every aspect of an internal pen test is not exactly like a breach, certain things are. Mm-hmm. And in this case, like you said, it reads like a pen test, and so it's just an interesting conversation, right? To draw those parallels, because we do get that pushback from blue teams from time to time.
Yep. Yeah, and the techniques are there. We might not use the same procedures. Like we might not use a define, for example, but maybe we'll use PowerView because there's no PowerShell restrictions enabled on the client environment, right? So
right.
Why not just use the easiest tool, and PowerShell is available and ready, right? Maybe we use Sliver or some other C2 framework as opposed to Cobalt Strike, right? We'll swap in different components or tools, but the techniques are there. In kind of what we're seeking and what we're looking to do on an internal pen test is very much the same, like you were saying. So really interesting. I love the DFIR report articles. I use these, and I love using these for kind of threat emulation, right? Running these through detection tools to see, okay, are we picking up on the use of a define, for example, or are we able to detect when there's scanning going on, when I'm just doing a ping scan or port scan on an internal network, right? Is that something we're able to detect, that kind of thing? So that's what I love doing and helping defenders do, is like emulate these things in order to test them and see how good is our visibility and where are our gaps.
Agreed.
A couple kind of key things I thought I wanted to point out with prevention and detection, right? I mentioned it already. We kind of talked about it. Catching the defaults, right? Default Cobalt Strike is very highly detected now, right? I don't think I've been in an engagement where I've just YOLO'd Cobalt Strike vanilla form and not get caught, even by defender, right?
Sure. It's surprising that even works at all.
Yeah. In this case, they used a default configuration. They used default named pipes. So a lot of it was just very default stuff. So catching the defaults, catching the well-known things is a good start, right? Catching a define, catching well-known LSAS dumping techniques, using well-known Kerberoasting tools like PowerView's invoke Kerberoast, which was used in this case. Seatbelt even, right? Catching the well-known stuff is important. It gives us a good baseline, and it helps us prevent kind of the low-hanging fruit. The second thing I wanted to mention is around ISOs, right? The initial access was through a zip file that contained an ISO that ultimately launched a DLL to implant the malware. You can prevent mounting ISOs through a group policy. So you can prevent mounting those files, and hopefully that kind of mitigates that a little bit. Now, there's other ways to mount those using PowerShell and things like that. Sure. But at least you have that protection through a group policy, and the attackers have to try a little bit harder, right, to do that. So those are my kind of two takeaways from this, from a detection/prevention standpoint.
Sure. Yeah, these guys aren't doing anything crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely. Again, I love these reports. It's a really good example of what's happening out there. So good stuff.
Yep, I like it.
The other kind of topic we wanted to talk about was SMS and voice phishing. And this comes in the form of a couple different things, right? Twilio announced they had an attack, a breach. Cloudflare announced around the same time that Twilio had this incident, that they were experiencing an attack on their environment. And then Cisco will be the kind of the third one that we talk about that's a little bit related, kind of. But the Twilio and Cloudflare are definitely more closely related. And essentially, the TLDR of this is that there was a couple customers of Twilio who had their accounts compromised through SMS phishing. So SMS phishing, as you know, is or may not know. I mean, depending on how often your users are seeing these things, you might not kind of notice this. But SMS phishing is still very tried and true. It's still very effective. And what this looks like is a user gets an SMS phishing message that directs them to a login page. That login page is oftentimes made to look like a login page that user would expect. You know, like an Okta login page, or in this case, a Twilio login page or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the user enters their credentials, and then, hey, let's say they have MFA, right? Maybe they're using OTP, you know, like the code on the authenticator. That login page will also capture that code and send it to the threat actor. So it's kind of a way to bypass MFA as well. And that's kind of what this incident is articulating. And same with the Cloudflare article. The attack was designed to not only steal credentials and get access, but to bypass MFA using this technique. So real interesting attacks. But the main thing is the prevalence of SMS phishing, and you know how that's still very effective today.
Literally 20-year-old technique, man.
Yeah.
You know, and this looks so when I first got exposed to SMS phishing was probably in like 05, 06, something like that, working for a bank. And it looked exactly like this. There's no change at all.
Yep. Yeah, and you know the interesting thing here is a couple interesting things. Is the threat actors registered domains that were similar to the target domain,
Sure.
right? So they registered these Twilio-SSL or Twilio-Okta, or in the case of the Cloudflare, I think it was Cloudflare-Okta.com, right? So they registered these lookalike domains and created a login page that looks like what the user would expect. So yeah, you know, this is a tried and true red team technique. This is a tried and true attack technique. And the Cloudflare article is really good. It talks about how they were awesome and how they stopped it and how they spent, you know, they have all these sophisticated things to prevent it. And we'll talk about defense a little bit at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things you can do to kind of prevent this that are that don't require spending millions of dollars, and we'll talk about that. But really good article nonetheless. It talks about how they prevented it, which is a good takeaway, right?
Sure. And you know, I think their strategy is really more large corporation strategy. We leverage some of the similar tactics, you know, in the finance world. And so, you know, we had a great deal of success using similar methods, but as you mentioned, it's pretty cost prohibitive.
Yep. Yeah. And we'll talk about more at the end, but essentially they have their Cloudflare, right? So they have these web gateways and all of this edge stuff that you can buy. But like you said, some of it's very costly, but there's things you can do like physical hardware tokens, UTF type tokens is one good way to mitigate phishing. And we'll talk more about that as we wrap up these two stories, but kind of a foreshadowing to that.
Cool.
The third article in this section of topics is from Cisco. Cisco had a similar type of attack. However, this one started a little differently. As I zoom in here, so Cisco had a employee's personal Google account compromised. So their personal Google account was compromised, and then that threat actor was able to steal their corporate, you know, enterprise password because the user had saved it in their browser. So in their browser is like Chrome password manager thing, and they had the synchronization turned on, right? So when you log in from a different device or something, you know, Google will synchronize. The user had this turned on, so they were able to get those passwords from the Chrome browser after compromising the user's personal Google account.
Sure.
And then the interesting part, or more interesting part, is they used voice phishing to essentially convince the user to accept the MFA prompt. So they just kept calling them, kept prompting them, and essentially, Cisco calls it, I think, MFA fatigue somewhere in this article.
Sure.
It's also referred to as like MFA bombing, where you just constantly berate the users with MFA prompts. But they combined it with voice phishing. They called them purporting to be, some trusted third party or trusted organization, saying, "Hey, you got to approve this for this reason." And ultimately, the attacker got in through the VPN using this technique. So, SMS phishing, voice phishing is still very real and very big threats to organizations.
Yeah, and this is an attack that we actually used this last week on a penetration test. And so, ultimately we didn't get in, but, it's part of the challenge of a layered approach. It's part of the challenges with MFA. And a lot of people, and you and I were having this conversation before the podcast, MFA is not a silver bullet. There are flaws with MFA implementations. There are issues with, like you said, fatigue with regards to push notifications or stuff like that. So, MFA is not a magic wand you can wave and make initial access go away. There's user education involved. There's configuration tightening that you can do. And more importantly, by the way, just there are so many lessons to be learned from this particular incident. But the biggest thing of all is it sounds like Cisco has a half-baked zero trust scenario, right? Why is a user's personal Google authenticated browser saving passwords to corporate resources? That sounds like a zero trust thing, kind of, but then we're still accessing it using potential. Anyway, it's just strange, right? It sounds like they're in the middle of a zero trust migration, and the only real protection against access to all this stuff was an MFA that could be spammed.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and again, this brings up the question of like you said, zero trust and how we protect remote users. Right, we're in a more remote world now. Everything is through a browser, through a web application. So how we protect those things and the secrets is more important than ever. And I've said this before, but if all that's standing between the bad actor and your bottom line is MFA, then we've got some work to do, right? We need to implement layered defense. And that just essentially means if I'm able to guess the password and get past MFA, then I, as attacker, should have some additional hurdles to go through, right? That's the goal, is make every step a little bit harder and make there be multiple steps the attacker has to jump through to get to their end goal.
And that's exactly why I mentioned zero trust, right? Because there are some fundamental concepts with regards to zero trust. So the reason I think Cisco has a partially implemented version of this is because, this user's using a browser at home, presumably, to access, sensitive company applications. But two, one of the foundational pillars of zero trust is context. Right, contextual access to things. If suddenly my browser is geolocated to Canada, right? Because those Canadians, and so and then suddenly I'm MFAing from a different place and trusting a different device. The applications themselves are responsible for validating that context and time of day. There's a million variables, but you're right. Fundamentally, MFA is not the end all be all, man.
Yep. Yeah, and there are more phishing resistant forms of MFA that companies should start looking at, right? MFA prompt, you'll very quickly see that MFA prompt is going to go away. It's just not going to be an option, just like SMS based authentication or multi-factor.
Yep.
In some ways, OTP is maybe a little bit better than prompt, depending on your users and the education and stuff. But FIDO tokens, so it's called FIDO2 security keys. That's what you can Google FIDO tokens or FIDO2 security keys or hardware key. It's something like a YubiKey, if you're familiar with that.
Yep.
They have different types of technologies built into them. Some of them have biometric, fingerprint readers on them. Really cool stuff, but essentially it's a hardware-backed token. It's a hardware-backed security key that can only be used like with it if it's physically in your presence. So it's phishing resistant. So if I have that hardware token, unless somebody has that hardware token, even if they have my password, they're not going to be able to get past MFA unless there's some technical flaw there that's being abused. So those are really big, and that's what Cloudflare said the reason why they didn't the attacker wasn't ultimately successful was because they used hardware-based security keys to kind of prevent that phishing attack.
And again, what's old is new. We used to have RSA tokens, like hard tokens, and they were just these little thumb drive shaped things that had codes that rotated. It's just interesting because we've already solved this problem, and then somehow we unsolved it, and now we're back to again 2004 when we're going to be shipping out hardware. So I mean, interesting for sure.
Yeah, and another thing that's maybe a little bit more advanced, but there are services you can subscribe to that can help you do this, is domain monitoring, right? Monitoring for lookalike domains. Obviously, this was a significant factor in the cases that we presented today, which is the Twilio, the Cloudflare incident, most likely the Cisco one too. We don't really know or have a lot of the details, but definitely in the Twilio incident and the Cisco incident, the attackers intentionally set up domains that looked like the target or looked reasonable or looked plausible to the user. So monitoring for lookalike domains or domains that are newly registered that have similarities with your own or products you use, things like that, is a good idea and can help be kind of a proactive measure.
Yep.
Of course, we talked about educating users. I think that's just, that goes without saying, but also some more advanced things are using web gateways. Like in the case of the Cloudflare article, they have these really cool web gateways and they have CASB and all this fancy stuff, which we said can get very pricey. But if you want to do more advanced stuff, that's the way to go, right? Is using these gateways that do URL filtering, and you can sandbox newly registered domains and all this cool fancy stuff. Along with the CASB, the Cloud Access Security Brokers, to manage those cloud apps. But that's getting into the more mature, advanced, fancy stuff. But definitely an option as well.
Agreed. That's good stuff, man.
Yeah.
All right, folks. So that's all we have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode or you got value from it, please share it with your folks and, rate, whatever all that good stuff is from whatever platform that you're getting this from. And most importantly, have a great weekend, and we will talk to you next week.